The alarms on the station went off before anyone had time to think. Red lights spilled across the negotiation chamber, bouncing off polished walls that had never once, in 40 years of use, seen an unscheduled arrival. I was standing near the translation console when the proximity sensors screamed, and for a moment every delegate in that room forgot how to breathe. A single ship had dropped out of faster-than-light travel, less than 200 kilometers from the station. No warning beacon, no approach signal, no clearance request. It simply appeared, silent and dark against the starfield, and every sensor operator in the room went pale at once. I remember the exact words the station's tactical officer used. He said, very quietly, as if saying it louder might make it more real, "That is a human vessel." The room erupted. Delegates from 6 different systems began shouting over each other in 5 different languages, and my translation implant struggled to keep pace with the panic. Someone demanded the shields be raised. Someone else insisted that raising shields would be seen as an act of aggression. A third delegate from the Colvin assembly simply sat frozen in his chair, staring at the screen as though the ship itself might climb through it and take him by the throat. I did not blame him. None of us had ever seen a human warship up close. We had only heard the stories, passed between systems like ghost tales meant to frighten young officers into obedience. Humanity had been quarantined for decades, sealed behind a border none of us fully understood, following an incident so old that most of the historical records had been reclassified or lost entirely. What remained was rumor. What remained was fear dressed up as diplomacy. I had been assigned to this summit as a cultural liaison, a translator of intention as much as language, because the coalition believed that words alone were never enough to keep the peace. My name is Nayel Korrath, and I have spent 11 years of my life trying to help different species understand each other well enough not to destroy one another. I thought I had seen every kind of tension a room could hold. I was wrong. The ship did not fire. It did not move. It simply sat there, exactly where it had appeared, as though daring anyone to make the first mistake. 10 minutes passed like this. The station's commander, an HFY elder named Torvun Mescal, ordered all channels opened for a formal communication attempt. He was polite. He was careful. He offered the appropriate greetings in 3 separate protocols, each one designed to avoid any possible offense. There was no answer. Then, without any further warning, a small shuttle detached from the underside of the warship and began its descent toward our docking bay. No weapons were charged. No defensive maneuvers were requested. It came in slow, almost gentle, the way a guest might walk toward a door they had been invited through 100 times before. I watched Torvun Mescal's hands shake as he gave the order to allow the shuttle to dock. He had no other choice. Refusing might have been seen as the very provocation everyone in that room feared. Allowing it might be exactly what the humans wanted. Either way, the decision had already been made the moment that warship appeared out of nothing. The chamber fell into a silence unlike any I had experienced before. Even the Colvin delegate, who moments earlier had seemed ready to bolt from his chair, now sat rigid, eyes fixed on the door through which our uninvited guest would soon walk. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because honesty is the only reason anyone should ever listen to a story like this one. I was afraid, not the sharp, immediate fear of physical danger, but a deeper unease, the kind that settles into your chest when you realize you understand far less than you believed you did. We had spent years constructing a narrative about humanity. We told ourselves they were unstable. We told ourselves they were dangerous only because they lacked the discipline of older, wiser civilizations. We told ourselves a great many comforting things, and every one of them was about to be tested by a single figure walking down a corridor toward a room full of people who had built entire careers on being right about species they had never truly met. The door opened. I do not know what I expected. Perhaps a soldier bristling with weapons and anger, matching the stories we had told each other in briefings and bar conversations for decades. Perhaps something monstrous, something that justified all the fear we had carried into that chamber. What walked through the door was a woman. She was not young, though she was not old either. Her hair was cut short and practical, her uniform plain, without the ornamentation most of our own officers wore, to signal rank and prestige. She carried nothing in her hands. No weapon, no escort, no visible support staff of any kind. She walked as though the room belonged to her already, though her expression held no arrogance, only a kind of tired patience that unsettled me more than open hostility would have. She stopped at the head of the table, looked around at each delegate in turn, and said nothing for what felt like an unbearably long moment. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm, almost gentle, the way someone speaks when they have already decided exactly what is going to happen and simply need the rest of the room to catch up. "My name is Mireille Okoro," she said. "I am a general of the United Nations Defense Fleet. I am here on behalf of every human colony that has been ignored by this council for the past 6 years." Nobody responded. Nobody seemed capable of it. She continued, without raising her voice, without any of the theatrical fury we had been taught to expect from her species. "I did not come here to threaten anyone. I came here because every formal request my government has submitted through proper channels has been delayed, dismissed, or quietly buried. I am done waiting for paperwork to catch up with reality." Torvun Mescal, to his credit, found his voice before anyone else did. "General Okoro," he said carefully, "this summit was arranged to discuss trade disputes along the border colonies. We were not informed of any additional human delegation." "There isn't one," she said. "There's me." The Colvan delegate let out a short, disbelieving laugh, quickly stifled when General Okoro turned her attention toward him. It was not an aggressive look. It was simply direct, the kind of look that makes you feel as though you have already been measured and found wanting. "You find that funny," she said. It was not a question. "I find it unusual," the delegate replied, recovering some of his composure, "that a single officer would arrive alone to a summit of this importance, aboard a vessel capable of erasing this station from existence, and expect us to believe there is no larger design behind it." "There is a design," she said. "I want this council to finally listen." I remember thinking, in that moment, that I had misjudged the danger of the room entirely. I had been afraid of the ship outside. I had been afraid of the unknown capability sitting silently in the dark beyond our shields. But the true danger, I realized, was standing directly in front of us, speaking in a level, patient tone, and utterly unwilling to be dismissed. She took a seat at the table, without invitation, and folded her hands in front of her. "I have read every transcript from every session this council has held regarding human border territories for the last 6 years," she said. "I know which delegates voted to delay inspection requests. I know which trade agreements were quietly altered after signing. I know whose signatures appear on documents that were never shown to the colonies they affected." The room had gone very still. I watched several delegates glance at one another, the kind of look shared between people who suddenly suspect they are the subject of a conversation they were not meant to overhear. "I am not here to make accusations," she continued. "I am here because those accusations are already documented, verified, and sitting in a file I would very much prefer never to open in this room." Torvun Mescal cleared his throat. "General, if there have been irregularities, I assure you the Council is prepared to review them through the proper channels." "The proper channels have had 6 years," she said simply. Nobody had an answer for that. I found myself watching her hands rather than her face, the way one might study an unfamiliar creature to determine whether it intends to strike. Her hands did not move. They remained folded, calm, entirely at rest. It was the stillness of someone who had already run through every possible outcome of this conversation long before walking through that door, and had concluded that patience, for now, was the correct approach. That stillness frightened me more than shouting would have. I had negotiated with furious diplomats before. I understood anger. Anger burns itself out eventually, and a skilled mediator can wait for the fire to pass. What I did not understand, what none of us in that room understood, was a person who had already stopped being angry and had instead become something colder and far more deliberate. "I would like to propose a new framework for these discussions," General Okoro said, breaking the silence. "Full transparency, effective immediately, regarding every agreement touching human territory for the past decade. I understand this will be uncomfortable for several parties in this room. I am not particularly concerned with comfort." The Colven delegate opened his mouth to object, and General Okoro raised one hand, not sharply, not with any obvious threat, simply enough to indicate that she was not finished speaking. "I would also like it noted," she said, "that the vessel currently sitting outside this station did not come here to start a conflict. It came here because every previous attempt to schedule this exact conversation through official request was ignored. I am told that pattern is called diplomacy, in this council's language. Where I come from, we call it something else." Nobody asked what that something else was. I think, in that moment, nobody in the room wanted to know. I glanced toward the viewport, where the dark shape of the human warship remained motionless against the stars, and I remember thinking that whatever it was capable of, whatever weapons it carried, whatever fear it had inspired the moment it appeared, none of that compared to the quiet, unshakable certainty in the voice of the woman sitting at our table. For the first time in my career, I understood that I was not translating language for this negotiation. I was translating patience running out, one carefully chosen word at a time, and I did not yet know how much of it remained. The session that followed lasted nearly 6 hours, though it felt far longer. General Okoro answered every question directed at her without hesitation, without consulting notes, without ever once raising her voice above the level she had used from the very first sentence. She cited dates, she cited names, she cited exact figures for supply shipments that had been rerouted away from human colonies under false justifications, and precise timestamps for communications that several delegates clearly wished had been deleted rather than merely misplaced. By the time the session adjourned for the evening, the mood in the chamber had shifted from fear to something closer to dread, though of a quieter, more clinical kind. We were no longer afraid of an unknown threat lurking outside our shields. We were afraid of exactly how much this one woman already knew, and precisely how long she had been waiting to say so. As the delegates filed out, I lingered near the doorway, watching General Okoro gather a small data slate from the table, the only object she had brought into the room at all. She noticed me watching and paused. "You're the translator," she said. It was not a question either. "Cultural liaison," I said. "Niel Korrath." She studied me for a moment, the way she had studied the entire room earlier, measuring and assessing, without any visible hostility. "Do you think they'll cooperate?" she asked. I considered lying, offering the kind of diplomatic reassurance my position required. I chose honesty instead. "I think they are more afraid of you than they have ever been of anything," I said. "I do not yet know if that fear will produce cooperation, or something else entirely." She nodded slowly, as though this was precisely the answer she had expected. "So do I," she said, and walked out into the corridor, leaving me alone in a chamber that suddenly felt far smaller than it had that morning. I stood there for a long while after she left, staring at the empty seats around that long table, and I thought about the stories we had told ourselves about humanity for so many years. Unstable, dangerous, undisciplined. I thought about the warship sitting silently beyond our shields, capable, by every report I had ever read, of ending this station in a matter of moments, and yet it had not fired a single shot, had not issued a single threat. It had simply waited, exactly as its general had waited, for the moment when patience would no longer be enough. I did not know it then, but that moment was already approaching, far faster than any of us in that chamber were prepared for. The morning after General Okoro's arrival, the station felt different in a way I could not immediately name. The corridors were quieter. Staff moved with their heads down, speaking in lowered voices, as though the walls themselves might repeat their words to someone listening. I had worked on that station for 3 years, and I had never seen it behave like a place holding its breath. I arrived at the negotiation chamber early, hoping to review the previous day's transcripts before the session resumed. General Okoro was already there. She sat alone at the long table, a cup of something steaming in front of her, reading through a stack of physical documents rather than a data slate. I found that detail strange at first, until I realized why. Physical paper could not be intercepted, altered, or erased remotely. She was not taking chances with anything. "You're early," she said, without looking up. "So are you," I replied. She allowed the faintest suggestion of a smile, gone almost before it appeared. "I don't sleep well on strange stations," she said. Too many unknowns in the walls. I took the seat across from her, uncertain whether I was permitted to speak freely, uncertain whether anything I said might be repeated to the very delegates I was meant to serve as a neutral party between. I did, in that moment, that neutrality had become a much more complicated idea than it had been the day before. "May I ask you something?" I said. She set down the page she had been reading. "You can ask. I make no promises about the answer. Yesterday you listed exact records, dates, names, shipment numbers. You did this without consulting any notes. How is that possible?" She considered the question for a moment, as though deciding how much of an answer I deserved. "Because I have spent every night for the past 4 months reading nothing else," she said. "While your council delayed meetings and rescheduled hearings, my staff and I went through every available record twice. We found the pattern before your own investigators did, because we had a reason to look for it that they did not." "What reason?" "People were dying," she said simply, "waiting for supplies that were being redirected for profit under false paperwork. I do not find that acceptable. I do not intend to pretend otherwise for the sake of politeness." I did not have a response to that. I had spent years training myself to remain composed in the face of anger, insult, even open hostility between negotiating parties. I had never trained myself for calm, documented certainty delivered without any apparent need for sympathy or applause. The other delegates began arriving over the following half-hour, each one visibly more cautious than the day before. Torvun Mescal entered last, flanked by 2 aides carrying data slates stacked with what I assumed were prepared counter-arguments. He took his seat at the head of the table and cleared his throat. "General Okoro," he began, "the Council has reviewed the concerns you raised yesterday. We would like to propose a joint investigative committee to examine the allegations further, with representation from all affected parties." "A committee," she repeated. "Yes, a structured, impartial process to determine the facts before any further action is considered." "I already have the facts," she said. "I brought copies for the entire council last night." "I understand your assistants delivered them to each delegation's private quarters." Several of the delegates shifted uncomfortably. I glanced toward the Colvin representative, whose expression had gone carefully blank in the specific way that suggested he very much did not want anyone reading his true reaction. "Even so," Torvun Mescal continued, "due process requires—" "Commander Mescal," General Okoro interrupted, her voice still level, still calm, "I understand due process. I respect due process, when it is used honestly. What I have watched happen over these past 6 years is not due process. It is delay disguised as procedure, used specifically because everyone in this room understood that eventually the affected parties would grow tired of waiting and give up. That is a serious accusation." "It is a documented pattern," she said. "I am happy to walk through it again, delegate by delegate, if that would be useful." Nobody asked her to. The negotiations that followed stretched across the rest of that day, and much of the next. What struck me most, watching from my position at the translation console, was not the content of the arguments, though they were substantial, but the way General Okoro conducted herself throughout. She never raised her voice. She never resorted to insult, even when several delegates attempted, with varying degrees of subtlety, to provoke exactly that reaction from her. The Colvin delegate, whose name I later learned was Seric Thane, seemed particularly determined to unsettle her. On the second day, during a discussion about resource allocation along a disputed border region, he leaned back in his chair with an expression of thin amusement. "Forgive me, General," he said, "but I find it curious that your species, having spent so many years quarantined for reasons your own government has never fully explained, now arrives expecting this council to simply accept your version of events without question." I felt the temperature of the room shift. Several delegates glanced toward General Okoro, clearly anticipating some visible reaction. She looked at Seric Thane for a long moment before responding. "You are correct that our history includes an incident this council has chosen not to discuss openly," she said. "I would be happy to discuss it, if you believe it is relevant to the matter of redirected medical supplies currently under review." Seric Thane's confidence faltered slightly. That will not be necessary. Then perhaps we should return to the matter at hand, she said, and moved on without any further comment, as though the exchange had cost her nothing at all. I found myself, over those 2 days, growing increasingly unsettled by something I could not immediately articulate. It was not fear of violence, not directly. It was something closer to the sensation of watching a puzzle assemble itself piece by piece, each new fact fitting into place with unnerving precision, while the full picture remained just out of view. During a brief recess on the second day, I found myself standing near a viewport with a colleague from the HFY delegation, a soft-spoken record-keeper named Ilvana Bresk. She had worked alongside human diplomats decades earlier, before the quarantine began, and I had always assumed her perspective might offer some useful context. "You've been quiet," she said, joining me at the viewport. "I am trying to understand something," I admitted. "The other delegates seem to believe General Okoro's calm demeanor is a kind of restraint, a temporary state that will eventually break under pressure. I do not believe that is accurate." Ilvana Bresk nodded slowly. "I worked alongside humans before the quarantine," she said. "Not many people remember that anymore. There is something you should understand about them, if you truly wish to understand what is happening in that room. Please, humans do not become calm when they run out of anger," she said. "They become calm when they have already decided what comes next, and no longer feel the need to convince anyone through emotion. The shouting, the arguing, all of that happens earlier, usually far away from rooms like this one. By the time a human arrives calm and precise in front of an audience, the decision has typically already been made. What you are watching now is not patience waiting to be tested. It is patience that has already been spent, replaced by something considerably more permanent. I did not sleep well that night. The third day of negotiations began with what I initially believed to be a minor procedural matter. The Council proposed a temporary suspension of new supply agreements to human colonies, pending the outcome of the investigative committee Torvun Mescal had suggested earlier, a measure intended, according to the official language, purely to preserve fairness while allegations were reviewed. General Okoro read the proposal twice before responding. "You are suggesting," she said, "that while my government's accusations of stolen supplies are investigated, further supplies should also be withheld." "A temporary measure," Torvun Mescal clarified quickly, "purely procedural. Colonies that are already receiving less than what was promised would receive even less, while a committee decides whether the original theft actually occurred. We understand the optics are unfortunate, General, but people are currently rationing medical supplies meant for children," she said, her voice not rising, not sharpening, remaining exactly as level as it had been since her arrival. "I am not interested in a procedure that punishes them further while this council decides whether their suffering is worth acknowledging." The room fell silent again. I watched Seric Thane glance toward Torvun Mescal, some silent communication passing between them that I could not fully interpret, though I understood its general shape well enough. They were testing her. They had been testing her since the moment she arrived, searching for the exact point where her composure would finally break, where she would say or do something that could be used to discredit every accusation she had made. She did not break. She simply set down the proposal, folded her hands once more, and waited. "I will not accept this measure," she said finally. "If this council intends to continue treating human suffering as a bargaining position, I want that decision recorded formally, with every delegate's name attached to it." Nobody moved to record anything. Nobody wanted their name attached to that particular sentence. By the end of the third day, the negotiations had produced almost no formal agreements, though something else had clearly shifted within the room. The other delegates, who had begun the summit treating General Okoro's presence as an unwelcome inconvenience to be managed and eventually dismissed, now regarded her with a wary, careful attention usually reserved for situations understood to be far more dangerous than a simple trade dispute. I remained behind after the session ended, reviewing my notes, trying to organize the tangled threads of accusation and evasion into something coherent enough to translate accurately for the official record. General Okoro remained as well, once again alone at the table, reading through another stack of physical documents. "May I ask you something else?" I said, You may. Why do you continue attending these sessions if you already possess the evidence you need? You could present your findings publicly, through whatever channels your government prefers, and bypass this council entirely. She considered this for a long moment. Because I want it recorded, clearly, that this council was given every opportunity to correct its own mistakes before anything further became necessary, she said. I want no ambiguity later about what was offered and what was refused. And if it continues to be refused, she looked at me then, and for the first time since her arrival, I saw something behind her calm expression that was not patience at all, but something colder, something already prepared for an answer she clearly expected to receive. Then the offer will not remain available indefinitely, she said, and returned to her documents, leaving me to sit with the full weight of that sentence, long after she had gone. By the fourth day, I had stopped believing that this summit would end the way summits usually ended, with a compromise nobody found entirely satisfying, and a document nobody fully trusted. Something else was building beneath the surface of every session, something I could sense but not yet name, the way one senses a storm long before the sky actually changes color. General Okoro arrived that morning with a different bearing than before. She still wore the same plain uniform, still carried herself with the same quiet composure, but there was something more deliberate in her movements, as though she had reached the end of some internal calculation and was now simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up with a conclusion she had already reached. The morning session began with a report from the Council's own logistics office, a dry recitation of numbers meant to demonstrate that supply shortages to human colonies were the result of general strain across the entire trade network, rather than any deliberate action. The official delivering the report, a nervous young HFY administrator named Petrin Solaus, read from his notes without once making eye contact with General Okoro. When he finished, she asked a single question. Can you explain why 3 separate shipments, all documented as destined for human colonies, were instead rerouted to Colvin processing facilities, according to manifest records your own office generated? Petrin Solaus went very pale. I would need to review those specific records before commenting. I have brought copies, she said, sliding a folder across the table. Please, take your time. He did not take his time. He simply stared at the folder, as though it might ignite if he touched it. Serik Thane leaned forward, his earlier amusement replaced by something sharper. General, if you are suggesting deliberate theft on the part of the Colvin Assembly, I would remind you that accusations without formal proceedings carry serious diplomatic consequences. I am not suggesting, she said, I am stating, based on documentation your own administration produced. Whether that documentation is accurate is a question I am happy to let this council resolve. I am simply asking that it be resolved honestly, rather than buried beneath another committee. I found myself, during that exchange, thinking again about what Ilvana Bresk had told me 2 nights before. Humans do not become calm when they run out of anger. They become calm when they have already decided what comes next. I looked at General Okoro's still, composed expression, and I wondered exactly how long ago that decision had already been made, long before she ever stepped onto this station. The afternoon session shifted toward a different, more personal register. Several delegates, apparently having concluded that direct confrontation was not producing the results they wanted, attempted a different approach. They began asking questions not about supply records, but about humanity itself, its history, its quarantine, its reasons for remaining sealed away from the rest of galactic society for so many decades. I understood immediately what they were attempting. If they could not discredit her evidence, perhaps they could discredit her, her species, her right to sit at this table making demands of civilizations far older than her own. General, said a delegate from the Outer Trade Guild, a quiet, calculating figure named Voss Ambril, who had said little throughout the previous sessions, I wonder if you might help us understand something. Your species was quarantined for what our historical records describe only as an unspecified incident of significant severity. Given that history, is it truly reasonable to expect this council to simply trust your account of events without independent verification? I watched General Okoro's expression carefully. There was no visible anger, no defensive tension in her posture. She simply considered the question as though weighing exactly how much of an answer the room deserved. "I understand the quarantine troubles you," she said. "I understand it troubles many species across this council. I will tell you what I am permitted to tell you. My species made mistakes, decades ago, that we have spent every year since trying to ensure never happen again. We accepted isolation as the price of that mistake, without argument, without resistance, for far longer than most species would have tolerated similar restriction." "That does not answer the question of trust," Vos Ambril pressed. "No," she agreed, "it does not. But consider this. For decades, humanity remained quietly behind its border, asking nothing of this council, beyond basic trade access, necessary for our colonies to survive. We did not demand representation. We did not demand apology for the restrictions placed upon us. We accepted the terms this council itself established. It was only when those terms began to be violated, quietly, repeatedly, at the direct expense of human lives, that I came here at all." The room absorbed this in silence. "So you ask whether my species can be trusted," she continued. "I would ask this council, in return, whether it has earned the trust it now demands from us, given how it has treated the one significant request we have made in all these years, which was simply to be treated fairly, under agreements this council itself signed." Nobody answered that question either. Later that evening, after the session had adjourned, I found myself walking the same corridor as Ilvana Bresk, both of us moving slowly, neither in any particular hurry to return to our private quarters. "You look troubled," she observed. "I am beginning to understand something I did not want to understand," I admitted. "This council has spent the past several days searching for a way to discredit General Okoro, to find some flaw in her evidence or her character significant enough to dismiss her concerns entirely. They have found nothing." "And that troubles you?" "It troubles me because I do not believe she came here expecting to find anything either," I said. "I believe she already knew, before she ever stepped foot on this station, that this council would not correct its own behavior voluntarily. I believe these sessions have never truly been about persuading anyone. I believe they have been about documentation, about ensuring that when the moment finally arrives, no one can claim they were not given a fair opportunity to change course." Ilvana Bresk was quiet for a long moment. "You may be right," she said finally. "I remember, from the years before the quarantine, a phrase humans used often in difficult negotiations. They called it building the record, not persuading the room in front of them, but ensuring that whatever came afterward could be justified beyond any reasonable doubt." "And what comes afterward, in your experience?" She did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice had grown quieter. "In my experience, once a human finishes building their record, they rarely feel the need to ask permission for whatever comes next." I did not sleep at all that night. The fifth day of negotiations began differently than the previous four. General Okoro arrived without the stack of physical documents she had carried each morning before. She carried only a single data slate, small and unremarkable, and set it on the table in front of her without opening it. "I understand this council has scheduled additional review sessions for the coming weeks," she said, once the delegates had settled into their seats. "I would like clarity on one point before we continue. Is it this council's position that the redirection of medical and structural supplies away from human colonies, documented over the past 6 years, requires further investigation before any corrective action is taken?" Torvun Meskal exchanged a glance with several of the other delegates before answering. "General, these matters are complex. Multiple parties, multiple jurisdictions, multiple layers of—" "Is that a yes?" she interrupted, gently, without hostility. He hesitated. "It is a yes, for now." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I would like that answer formally recorded," she said. "For now, meaning this council intends to continue withholding corrective action indefinitely, while additional committees examine evidence that has already been provided in full." "That is not an accurate characterization," Seric Thane objected. "Then correct me," she said. "Tell me a specific date by which this council intends to resolve these findings and restore proper supply agreements to the colonies affected." Silence answered her instead. She waited nearly a full minute, long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of statement before she finally spoke again. "I have spent 5 days in this chamber," she said, "presenting evidence this council cannot refute, watching delegates search for reasons to delay rather than reasons to act. I came here because my government believed, perhaps too generously, that this council still valued the agreements it had signed. I am beginning to understand that belief may have been a mistake." "General, please," Torvun Mescal said. "I would ask that we not allow frustration to derail productive discussion." "I am not frustrated, Commander," she said, and her voice, even then, remained entirely level. "I am simply running out of reasons to continue believing that further discussion will change anything." The session ended shortly afterward, without resolution, without agreement, without even a scheduled date for the next meeting. As the delegates filed out, I noticed something I had not seen before. Several of them, Seric Thane included, kept glancing toward the viewport, toward the dark silhouette of the human warship still sitting exactly where it had appeared 5 days earlier, patient and silent, waiting for something none of us could yet name. I remained behind again that evening, unable to bring myself to leave the chamber. General Okoro sat alone at the table, staring at the small data slate in front of her, still unopened. "You haven't looked at that all week," I said, before I could stop myself. "I don't need to," she said. "I already know what it contains." "Then why carry it?" She looked up at me, and for the first time since her arrival, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like sadness, quickly folded away beneath the same composed stillness she had maintained since the very first moment she walked through that door. "Because some decisions deserve a moment of consideration, even when the outcome was never truly in doubt," she said. "I would rather remember that I gave this council every chance to be better than it has been. I do not think I will need to remember it for very much longer." She left without another word, and I sat alone in that chamber for a long while afterward, staring at the empty seat where she had been, and at the small data slate she had left behind, resting untouched on the polished surface of the table. The message arrived during the 6th morning session, interrupting a discussion so minor I no longer remember its subject. A junior communications officer entered the chamber without announcement, an act so far outside protocol that every delegate turned to stare before he had even reached the table. He moved directly toward General Okoro and placed a single sealed data cylinder in front of her, then stepped back and waited. She opened it without a word. I watched her face as she read whatever information appeared on the small display. I had spent 6 days studying that face, learning its subtle signals, the barely perceptible shifts that told me more than her carefully chosen words ever did. What I saw now was not anger. It was something far more still, far more finished, like a door quietly closing somewhere deep inside her. "General," Torvun Mescal said carefully, "is something wrong?" She did not answer immediately. She set the data cylinder down, folded her hands the way she always did, and looked around the table slowly, meeting the eyes of every delegate in turn. "A relief convoy carrying medical supplies to the Halvern colony was intercepted 6 hours ago," she said finally. "The convoy was clearly marked, traveling under an approved transit corridor, escorted by 2 unarmed transport vessels. It was attacked without warning." The room went silent in a way I had not yet experienced during the entire summit, a silence with actual weight to it, pressing down on every person present. "Attacked by whom?" Seric Thane asked, though something in his voice suggested he already feared the answer. "That is the question, isn't it?" General Okoro said. "The attacking vessels used weapon signatures and communication codes registered to a splinter faction operating outside official Colvin Assembly authority. I am told this faction has no formal ties to this council." "Then this has nothing to do with these proceedings," Torvun Mescal said quickly. "I would agree," she said, "except for one detail. The convoy's flight path, its cargo manifest, and its exact departure schedule were only shared with 3 parties prior to the attack: my government, the station logistics office responsible for authorizing the transit corridor, and this council's own supply oversight committee. Nobody spoke. I am not accusing anyone in this room directly," she continued, her voice still level, still measured, though something underneath it had changed, something colder settling into place. I am simply noting that information intended to remain confidential between three parties somehow reached a group with both the capability and apparent motivation to attack an unarmed medical convoy at the exact moment and location where it would be most vulnerable. General, surely you cannot believe this council authorized such an act, Vos Ambrel said, though his usual calculating calm had cracked slightly around the edges. I do not believe this council authorized it directly, she said. I believe someone within this council's structure, someone with access to information that should have remained protected, allowed it to happen, whether through direct action or convenient silence. I intend to find out which. She reached into the small satchel she had carried into the chamber every day of the summit and withdrew a folder, thicker than any she had presented before. She opened it and began placing images across the table, one at a time, deliberate and unhurried. I did not look closely at the images. I did not need to. The reaction of the delegates around me told me everything the images contained. Several turned away entirely. Ilvana Bresk pressed a hand to her mouth. Even Serek Thane, who had spent the entire summit searching for ways to challenge General Okoro's composure, went completely silent, staring down at the table rather than the images themselves. These are the recovered records from the convoy's emergency transmission buoy, General Okoro said. I will not describe them further. I do not believe description is necessary. Torvun Mescal's voice, when he finally found it, was barely above a whisper. How many? 43 crew and support staff aboard the transport vessels, she said. None survived. The medical supplies aboard were intended for a colony currently experiencing a shortage this council was already aware of, having spent the past 6 days debating whether to acknowledge that shortage at all. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it during the summit. It was not the silence of delegates searching for a clever rebuttal or waiting to see whether General Okoro's composure would finally crack. It was the silence of people who understood, perhaps for the first time, that something had shifted permanently and that whatever came next would not follow the pattern of the previous 6 days. I want to be very clear about what I am about to say, General Okoro said, gathering the images back into their folder with slow, careful movements. I did not come to this station intending to threaten this council. I came here hoping, perhaps foolishly, that presenting clear evidence of ongoing harm would be sufficient to produce corrective action. I have spent 6 days demonstrating patience. I no longer believe this council has earned. General, please, Torvun Mescal said, whatever has happened, I assure you this council will conduct a full and immediate investigation into. I am no longer interested in investigations that produce nothing but further delay, she said, and though her voice remained level, there was a finality in it now that silenced him immediately. I have watched this council investigate stolen supplies for 6 years without resolution. I do not intend to watch it investigate the deaths of 43 people with the same result. She rose from her seat, and something in the way she moved, unhurried, deliberate, entirely certain, made every delegate in the room go very still, as though sensing the approach of something they had spent the entire summit hoping to avoid. I would like this council to understand something, she said. My government did not send a single warship to this summit because we believed a single warship would be sufficient to resolve 6 years of grievances through quiet diplomacy. We sent it because it was, I believed, a proportionate demonstration of seriousness without being an unnecessary escalation. She paused, looking slowly around the table once more. I no longer believe proportionate demonstrations are sufficient, she said. Serek Thane, to his credit, found his voice before anyone else. General, whatever your grievance, surely there remains room for further discussion before. Before what, delegate, she said, turning her full attention toward him. Before I do something this council will regret? I would remind you that 43 people are no longer capable of having that same conversation. I would remind you that this council has been given 6 years, and then 6 additional days, to demonstrate that human lives carry the same weight in this chamber as any other species represented here. I do not believe that demonstration has been made. Nobody in the chamber spoke. I do not think anyone was capable of it. I have spent this entire summit building a record, she continued, and I felt a cold recognition settle over me as I remembered the words Ilvana Bresk had spoken to me only days before. I wanted it clearly documented, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this council was given every opportunity to correct its behavior before further action became necessary. I believe that record is now complete. She gathered the folder of images and placed it gently on the table in front of Torvun Mescal. I would ask that this council review these records at its leisure, she said. I no longer believe leisure is something my government can afford to extend. She turned and walked toward the door, unhurried, exactly as she had walked into that same chamber 6 days earlier. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at the assembled delegates one final time. I came here hoping to avoid what happens next, she said quietly. I want that understood clearly, whatever follows. I gave this council every chance. Then she was gone, and the chamber remained in absolute silence for a long time afterward, every delegate staring at the folder she had left behind, none of them yet willing to open it, as though refusing to look might somehow undo what had already been seen. I sat at my translation console, hands trembling slightly, and thought about the small data slate she had left untouched on the table 2 nights before. I understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and heavy in my chest, exactly what decision that slate had contained, and exactly how long she had already known what today would bring. The council reconvened that same afternoon, though reconvened is perhaps too generous a word for what actually happened. Delegates arrived shaken, whispering among themselves in small clusters, none of them willing to sit at the long table, until General Okoro herself entered the chamber. When she did, the room fell silent immediately, the way a crowd goes quiet before an announcement it already dreads hearing. She did not sit, she stood at the head of the table, exactly where Torvun Mescal usually presided, and though no one had offered her that position, no one moved to reclaim it either. I have received confirmation, she said, that the faction responsible for yesterday's attack received targeting information from a source inside this station's own communications network, roughly 4 hours before the convoy departed. Vos Embrel's calculating composure had entirely abandoned him by this point. General, if there has been a security breach, this council will cooperate fully with any investigation your government wishes to conduct. I appreciate the offer, she said, though I no longer believe further investigation is what this situation requires. Then what does it require? Sarek Thane asked, and for the first time since her arrival, his voice held no trace of his earlier arrogance, only something closer to genuine unease. General Okoro looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight I had not heard in it before, not anger exactly, but something far more absolute. 6 years ago, she said, my government submitted a formal request to this council, asking for equal representation in matters directly affecting human territory. That request was denied, on the grounds that our species had not yet demonstrated sufficient stability following our quarantine. She let that sentence rest in the silence for a moment before continuing. 6 days ago, I arrived at this station hoping to demonstrate exactly that stability, through patience, through evidence, through a willingness to sit at this table and be questioned, challenged, even insulted, without responding in kind. I believed that demonstration might finally earn my government the standing it has been denied for 6 years. General, I believe this council recognizes now that... Yesterday, she continued, ignoring the interruption entirely, 43 of my people died because information meant to remain confidential within this council's structure reached those who wished them harm. I do not know yet whether that breach was deliberate or merely negligent. I have decided it no longer matters which. She reached into her satchel one final time and withdrew nothing this time. No folder, no images, no documents. Her hands, when she raised them, were entirely empty, and somehow that emptiness felt more final than anything she had presented before. No more talks, she said. Let the war commence. The words fell into that chamber like something physical, something with actual mass, and I felt every delegate around me go rigid at once, as though the sentence itself had reached out and touched each of them individually. For a moment nobody moved, nobody spoke. I do not think anyone fully understood, in that first instant, exactly what those 5 words meant, or how quickly the meaning would become clear. Then the station's proximity alarms began sounding, louder and more insistent than they had on the day of General Okoro's arrival, and every screen in the chamber flickered to life with sensor readings that made my translation implant struggle to keep pace with the sheer volume of incoming data. Ships, dozens of them, then hundreds, emerging from concealment across a perimeter that encircled not just the station, but the entire system beyond it. Vessels that had apparently been sitting silent and hidden for the entire 6 days of negotiation, waiting, exactly as General Okoro herself had been waiting, for a moment that had finally arrived. Torvun Mescal's face had gone the color of old ash. "That is not possible," he whispered. "Our long-range sensors would have detected a fleet of that size." "Your sensors were never meant to detect them," General Okoro said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, no triumph. Only the same tired certainty she had carried since the moment she first walked through that door. "They were built to remain hidden until I decided otherwise." "You brought an entire fleet," Sarek Thane said, his voice barely audible, and said nothing. "I brought exactly what was necessary to demonstrate seriousness, and nothing more, for 6 full days," she said. "I gave this council every opportunity to resolve this matter through the process it claims to value so highly. I documented every refusal, every delay, every quiet act of negligence that led to yesterday's tragedy. I did this because I wanted absolute clarity, for my own government and for history, about who bears responsibility for what happens next." She turned toward the viewport, where the dark shapes of an entire concealed fleet now filled the void beyond the station, and I watched something in her posture settle, as though a weight she had carried for 6 days had finally been set down. "I did not want this outcome," she said quietly, and for the first time, I believed I heard something genuine beneath the composure, something that might have been grief. I would have preferred a different ending to these 6 days. But I will not pretend surprise that it has come to this, and I will not delay any further out of misplaced hope that patience alone will change what this council has already shown itself willing to tolerate. General, please, whatever action you intend to take, surely there remains room to discuss terms, to avoid further loss of—" "There was room," she said, turning back to face him. "There was room for 6 days. There was room for 6 years before that. I am done asking this council to find that room on its own." The alarms continued sounding around us, growing more frantic as additional sensor arrays across the station struggled to process the scale of what had emerged from concealment. I found myself gripping the edge of my console, watching the readouts multiply faster than I could track, and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that everything I had believed about the balance of power in this region of space had just been proven entirely, catastrophically wrong. "I want this council to understand something clearly," General Okoro said, raising her voice for the first time since her arrival, though it still carried more control than volume. "This is not an act of conquest. I have no interest in claiming territory that does not belong to my government. This is a demonstration, long overdue, that human patience has limits, and that those limits have now been reached." "What do you intend to do?" Voss Ambril asked, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by something close to genuine fear. "That intend to ensure that this council never again mistakes patience for weakness," she said. "I intend to ensure that the next time a human colony requests fair treatment under agreements this council itself signed, that request is honored without 6 years of delay and 6 days of empty procedure." She began walking toward the door once more, exactly as she had 6 days earlier, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now, charged with a weight that had not existed during her first departure. At the threshold, she paused again, just as she had before, and looked back at the assembled delegates, their faces pale with a fear I understood completely, having felt something similar building in my own chest since the moment those 5 words left her mouth. "I gave you every chance," she said, quiet and final. "I hope, whatever follows, that this council remembers exactly how many chances it was given and exactly how it chose to use them." Then she was gone, and the chamber dissolved into chaos, delegates shouting into communication devices, demanding information, demanding explanations, demanding a version of events that made sense of what had just happened in front of them. I remained frozen at my console, staring out at the viewport, at the vast, silent fleet arrayed against the stars, and I understood, with absolute certainty, that whatever this council believed it understood about humanity, about its patience, its restraint, its willingness to be dismissed and delayed, and quietly wronged, all of it had just been proven to be a dangerous, foolish misunderstanding. The war, whatever shape it would take, had already begun the moment she spoke those 5 words. Everything that followed would simply be the galaxy learning, far too late, exactly what it had spent 6 years failing to understand. What followed in the weeks after General Okoro's departure did not resemble any conflict I had studied during my years of service. I had been trained to understand warfare between the older civilizations of this council, campaigns that unfolded slowly, cautiously, shaped by centuries of tradition, regarding honorable engagement, formal declarations, and carefully staged confrontations, designed to minimize unnecessary loss on both sides. I expected humanity's response, however severe, to eventually follow some recognizable pattern. It did not. The station itself was never attacked. I want to be clear about that, because in the confusion of those early days, rumors spread faster than any official communication could correct them. The human fleet that had emerged from concealment made no move against the summit station or its occupants. Instead, over the following days, reports began arriving from across the region, describing something far stranger, and in its own way, far more unsettling than a direct assault would have been. Colven assembly supply routes, the same routes that had for years quietly diverted resources away from human colonies, began experiencing what official reports described only as significant operational disruption. Ships found their navigation systems rerouted through corridors that led nowhere useful. Communication networks between certain Colven processing facilities and their trade partners simply stopped functioning, replaced by silence that no amount of technical troubleshooting could resolve. Financial systems tied to the very transactions General Okoro had spent 6 days documenting found themselves frozen, audited, exposed to public scrutiny across dozens of systems simultaneously. Humanity, it became clear, had not spent those 6 years of quarantine sitting idle behind their border, waiting quietly for permission to rejoin galactic society. They had spent that time watching, learning, mapping the intricate networks of trade and influence that connected this council's member species, understanding exactly how those networks functioned and precisely where their vulnerabilities lay. I remember speaking with Ilvana Bresk during those early days, both of us struggling to process reports that seemed to contradict everything we understood about warfare between civilizations. "They are not fighting the way anyone expected them to fight," she said, reviewing yet another report, describing a Colven trade fleet stranded in open space, its systems compromised without a single shot fired against it. "I do not understand how a single warship and its hidden fleet could accomplish all of this so quickly. Perhaps it was never about the fleet at all," I said, the realization settling over me even as I spoke it aloud. Perhaps the fleet was simply the visible portion of something far larger, something that had already been in motion long before General Okoro ever stepped onto this station. I later learned, through official channels far too slow to keep pace with events on the ground, that this assessment was closer to accurate than I could have known at the time. Humanity's approach to this conflict relied less on direct confrontation and more on precise, coordinated disruption, striking at the specific systems and individuals responsible for the years of quiet theft and negligence General Okoro had documented so thoroughly during the summit. Reports described human vessels arriving at strategic points not to engage in prolonged confrontation, but to disable, isolate, and expose, often withdrawing before any sustained conflict could develop at all. Where older civilizations might have measured victory in territory claimed or vessels destroyed, humanity appeared to measure it in something else entirely: information exposed, corruption dismantled, systems of quiet exploitation rendered suddenly, permanently unworkable. This did not mean the conflict was without genuine confrontation. Several engagements did occur, particularly when Colven military assets attempted direct retaliation against the human fleet, believing, as many of us initially had, that humanity's restraint during the summit represented some fundamental limitation rather than deliberate choice. Those engagements did not last long. I read the reports with a growing, uncomfortable understanding of exactly what Ilvana Bresk had tried to explain to me weeks earlier. Human forces did not panic under losses the way conventional military doctrine across this council expected an opposing force to panic. Ships that sustained damage others would have considered catastrophic continued fighting with what observers described only as unsettling, methodical calm. Human commanders adapted their strategies mid-engagement with a speed that left Colvan tactical officers, trained in far more rigid traditions of honorable confrontation, consistently several steps behind. I spoke, some weeks into the conflict, with a Colvan officer who had survived one such engagement, a young tactical specialist named Dessa Korlath, who had been transferred to the summit station for medical evaluation. She described the experience with a kind of haunted precision that stayed with me long afterward. "We had them outnumbered," she told me, her voice quiet, still processing what she had witnessed. 3-1, by every measure our sensors could confirm. We expected them to withdraw once the engagement turned unfavorable. That is what any reasonable commander would do. "They did not withdraw?" "They adjusted," she said. "Within minutes, their formation had shifted into a pattern our own tactical systems could not immediately categorize. They were not simply reacting to our attacks. They had already anticipated several possible configurations we might use, and had prepared responses to each one in advance, as though the entire engagement had already been fought 100 times in simulation before it ever began in reality." "And the outcome?" She was silent for a long moment before answering. "We withdrew," she said simply. "It was the only reasonable choice remaining to us." Stories like this repeated across the following weeks, each one reinforcing the same unsettling truth. Humanity had not arrived at this conflict improvising a response to sudden provocation. Every action taken by their forces suggested extensive, patient preparation, contingencies built for outcomes that had not yet occurred, strategies refined long before General Okoro ever set foot on the summit station. I began to understand, during those weeks, that the 6 years of quarantine humanity had endured were not simply a period of passive isolation, as this council had always assumed. They had been a period of quiet, deliberate preparation, humanity studying the very civilizations that had chosen to isolate them, understanding precisely how those civilizations operated, and precisely how they might one day need to respond if patience alone proved insufficient. The most unsettling reports, however, did not describe military engagements at all. They described the slow, methodical exposure of exactly what General Okoro had spent 6 days documenting in that negotiation chamber. Colvin officials responsible for redirecting supplies away from human colonies found their private communications, their financial records, their carefully hidden arrangements, suddenly public knowledge across dozens of systems, presented not through propaganda or exaggeration, but through precise, verifiable documentation that left little room for denial. Public sentiment across the wider council began shifting in ways few had anticipated. Species that had spent decades viewing humanity with suspicion, shaped by old rumors and incomplete history, found themselves confronted instead with clear evidence of exactly what had been done to human colonies, and exactly who had done it. Sympathy, cautious and uncertain at first, began emerging in places that had shown none before. I remember the moment I fully understood the shape of what humanity had actually done, weeks into the conflict, reviewing yet another report describing the collapse of a trade network that had quietly profited from stolen human supplies for years. It was not a war fought to conquer, or even primarily to punish. It was a war fought to expose, to dismantle, and ultimately to force this council into confronting a truth it had spent 6 years avoiding through delay and quiet procedure. General Okoro had told the truth in that final session. This had never been about territory. It had been about ensuring that patience was never again mistaken for permission to continue causing harm unchecked. The conflict, if it could still be called that by this point, did not end in the way conflicts typically ended, with decisive victory celebrated by one side and defeat mourned by the other. It ended, instead, with this council finally forced to confront, publicly and undeniably, everything General Okoro had spent 6 days trying to make it acknowledge voluntarily. I did not yet know, during those uncertain weeks, exactly what would follow once the immediate crisis subsided. I understood only that the galaxy I had known before General Okoro's arrival, one where humanity remained a distant, quarantined rumor, easily dismissed and quietly wronged, no longer existed. Something new had taken its place, and none of us fully understood yet what that new reality would demand of us. The summons to return to the negotiation chamber arrived nearly 2 months after General Okoro first walked out through its doors. By then, the council that had once treated her presence as an unwelcome inconvenience looked nothing like the confident body I remembered from those first tense days. Half the original delegates had been replaced, some through formal removal after the exposure of their roles in the years of quiet theft, others simply resigning rather than face the scrutiny now falling on every corner of the council's operations. Torvun Mescal remained, though the weight of the past months showed clearly in the tired lines of his face. Serik Thane did not return at all. I later learned he had been recalled by the Colvan Assembly itself, facing consequences within his own government far more severe than anything this council might have imposed. Vos Ambril remained as well, though his earlier calculating confidence had been replaced by something far more cautious, a man clearly determined never again to be caught on the wrong side of a demand he had once dismissed too easily. I stood at my translation console once more, feeling an echo of the same tension that had filled this room on the day of General Okoro's first arrival, though everything about the atmosphere now felt different. There was no panic this time, no frantic uncertainty about an unidentified vessel appearing without warning. There was only a quiet, resigned understanding that whatever came through that door next would shape the remainder of this council's future. General Okoro entered exactly as she had the first time, calm, unhurried, carrying nothing but a single data slate. She took her seat without invitation, exactly as before, and looked around the table at the faces both familiar and new. "I understand this council has convened a formal session to discuss terms," she said. "I appreciate that this time, no invitation was required to secure my attendance." Torvun Mescal did not attempt any of his earlier procedural caution. "General Okoro, on behalf of this council, I would like to formally acknowledge the harm caused to human colonies over the past 6 years and express our regret for the failures of oversight that allowed it to continue unchecked." "Thank you," she said simply. "I would like to move directly to the terms my government proposes, if this council is prepared to hear them." "We are prepared," he said. She opened the data slate she had carried, the same one I remembered her leaving untouched on this very table months earlier, and began speaking without consulting it further, as though she had long since memorized every word it contained. "First," she said, "full reparations to every human colony affected by redirected supplies over the past 6 years, calculated according to documentation already provided to this council, to be paid in resources and infrastructure support rather than currency alone." Nobody objected. "Second," she continued, "permanent human representation on every committee overseeing trade agreements affecting human territory, with full voting authority equal to any other member species." Vos Ambril nodded slowly, offering no resistance. "Third," she said, "an independent oversight body, with representation from species outside this council entirely, to monitor future agreements and ensure the pattern of quiet exploitation this council allowed cannot recur without immediate exposure." A murmur passed through the assembled delegates at this proposal, though none voiced formal objection. "And finally," she said, her voice carrying a weight that silenced whatever murmur remained, "full dismantling of the labor arrangements operating within Colvan processing facilities along the human border, arrangements that this council's own investigators have now confirmed relied on undocumented, coerced workers from several vulnerable populations across this region." The room went still. I had heard rumors of this final matter during the weeks of conflict, whispered references to something far darker than simple supply theft, something that had apparently been the true, hidden purpose behind the years of quiet redirection this council had allowed to continue. I understood now, hearing it spoken plainly for the first time, exactly what General Okoro had uncovered during those long nights of preparation before she ever arrived at this station. These facilities will be dismantled, Torvun Mescal said quietly, and their operators held accountable under whatever jurisdiction proves appropriate. Thank you, General Okoro said, and for the first time since I had known her, something in her posture eased slightly, as though a burden she had carried for a very long time had finally, partially, been set down. The session continued for several more hours, working through the specific details of implementation, timelines, and verification measures, though the tension that had defined every previous session had largely dissipated, replaced by something closer to genuine, if cautious, cooperation. By the time the delegates finally rose to depart, an agreement had been reached that I suspected would reshape this council's relationship with humanity for generations to come. I remained behind once more, as I had after every previous session, and found General Okoro gathering her single data slate, preparing to leave the chamber for what I understood would likely be the final time. May I ask you something? I said. You may. Do you believe this council has truly changed, or simply learned to fear the consequences of being caught? She considered the question carefully, the way she considered every question directed at her. I believe it may be both, for now, she said. I do not expect genuine change to arrive quickly or easily. I expect it will require years of careful oversight and constant vigilance against the same patterns reasserting themselves in quieter, more careful forms. And if they do reassert themselves, she looked at me, and though her expression remained composed, I saw something behind it that I recognized now, having spent months coming to understand the particular stillness that settled over her before any significant decision. Then I hope this council remembers exactly what happened the last time it mistook patience for permission, she said. I do not believe humanity will need to demonstrate that lesson twice. She turned to leave, and I found myself following her out into the corridor, unwilling to let this conversation end without understanding one final thing. You never opened that data slate, I said, the one you carried throughout the entire summit, before everything changed. I saw you carrying it the day before you announced the fleet. She paused, and for a long moment, said nothing at all. It contained the order authorizing full engagement, she said finally, prepared before I ever arrived at this station, in case these negotiations failed, as I feared they eventually would. I never needed to open it, because by the time the moment came, I no longer needed to be told what I already knew I would have to do. You knew, before you even arrived, that this council would fail to act. I hoped I was wrong, she said. I have found, across a long career, that hope and expectation are rarely the same thing, though I have learned never to abandon the first, even when the second proves more accurate. She walked away down the corridor, and I did not see her again after that day. Reports later confirmed her fleet's quiet withdrawal from the region, humanity's border restrictions gradually easing over the following months, as the terms of the new agreement took effect. Careful and deliberate, exactly as everything about her approach to this entire conflict had been. I have spent the years since reflecting on those 6 days and the months that followed them, and I have come to understand something about humanity that this council, in all its long history, had somehow failed to grasp. They are not a species defined by anger, or instability, or the violent unpredictability we had been taught to fear for so long. They are a species defined by patience, careful and deliberate, extended far longer than most civilizations would tolerate, and withdrawn only when every other reasonable option has been exhausted entirely. I do not know whether this council has truly learned the lesson General Okoro tried so patiently to teach it. I know only that I have never again allowed myself to underestimate the quiet stillness of someone who has already decided what comes next, and is simply waiting, with more patience than any of us deserved, for the rest of us to understand it too. If there is one thing I would ask anyone hearing this account to remember, it is this. Never mistake a calm, measured voice for weakness, and never, under any circumstances, believe that patience, once finally exhausted, can be bought back with empty words and further delay. Some doors, once closed, do not open again, the same way twice.